My lady, I am very conscious of the time, and I will try and be as swift as I can. I appreciate Dr. Jayaram has had a very, very long day, and I am not going to make it any easier for him. Okay. Dr. Jayaram, the duty of Candour. Sir Robert Francis defined it as the volunteering of all relevant information to persons who have or may have been harmed by the provision of services, whether or not the information has been requested, and whether or not a complaint or report about that provision has been made. I presume you agree with that?
I couldn't disagree with it at all.
And it's one of the fundamental axioms of medical practice. In pediatrics and elsewhere, you have been asked many times during the evidence today about the meeting you had with the executives on June 29th, 2016. I won't go into it in any more detail, but it suffices to say that this was your first direct contact with them, in which you laid out your concerns that you thought a nurse, Lucy Letby, was murdering the babies and that was responsible.
Potentially, yes. Yes.
And indeed, you speculated in that meeting about the mechanism of murder, possibly air embolism and via a cannula or some other mechanism. You spoke out loud?
Yes.
But didn't have the answer?
No.
You have also said in your evidence in writing that after that you thought, I better have a look at this, and you found the Tanswell and Lee paper.
That's right.
And we know the history of where that ended up.
Yes.
And I think you subsequently said to the Royal College that you find that chilling when you first found that paper.
I think when I read the description of the skin changes, because it tallied with what colleagues and myself had been aware of.
So that's the end of June 2016. 2 months later, or thereabouts, the Royal College actually arrive on site and they speak to you and Dr. Breary. And in fact, you have a rather similar conversation, if not in more detail, with the review team, in which both of you lay out in full and articulately all of your concerns about the mortality, including the fact that a particular nurse was on shift at night when they happened, and then when she was moved, the collapses and deaths happened on the day shifts as well. And you mentioned that a lot of information, I won't go through all of it in the interests of time, but one of the things that you mentioned was the unexpected, unexplained nature and the failure to respond as you would expect, physiologically to standard resuscitation?
Correct.
All of which is highly significant because it's unusual, and that's correct?
That's correct, yes.
And as you had done at the end of June 2016, you have speculated out loud in front of the reviewers as to how the murders might have been committed, and you queried injecting air into babies. Do you remember that?
Yes. I think we discussed these are possibilities and we hadn't found any other obvious clinical causes. I don't think I was saying, this is what's happened, but it was a possibility.
And I think you specifically mentioned Child A in that context.
Sorry?
You specifically mentioned Child A.
Yes.
As well as the triplets and others, it's right to say. And I think you also mentioned police, and the possibility that they could be called, which had been discussed with the executives.
Yes.
You may not remember all of that, but have you jogged your memory?
Yes, we discussed that. And I think I discussed that we'd also been told that it wasn't the right thing to do at that time.
Scroll forward another few months, and the inquest final arises quite a long time after the death of Child A in respect of his death. And you must have been involved in a number of inquests over the years, sadly.
In the past, yes.
And given evidence at them?
Yes.
So you were aware of the basic statutory purpose of an inquest?
Yes.
Who the deceased was, how, when, and where they came by their death. And your bit as the physician is the how bit, the how question. Why have they died medically? Yes. You are nodding.
Yes.
You are also aware, I would assume, that the coronial system is one of the ways in which this country investigates whether or not something untoward has happened. Whether or not a death is unnatural in the sense that there's been foul play.
Yes.
And it used to be that they could commit people for trial from inquests. These days they are linked in with the police and the criminal justice system, and you know that the police will often be involved with inquests?
Yes.
You provided a statement a month or so after baby A's death in which you dealt with, in a very standard way, with precisely your involvement with his care. So coming on scene, the collapse. The administration of resuscitation and of course his untimely death, and that must have been a familiar process for you providing that kind of statement.
Yes.
A year or so later, because the inquest is delayed for many, many months, there are a series of meetings about the inquest. And I think you have now jogged your memory and seen that there is in fact a note of, I think possibly a telephone meeting or a direct meeting.
Yes.
At which you were in fact present. May I ask you about that insofar as you can now remember, having jogged your memory? Was it discussed, or did you discuss, or anyone else discuss in any of those meetings, the possibility of a criminal act having been committed?
I can't remember in that meeting, that pre-inquest meeting, whether I specifically raised that concern. Stephen Cross, who was running that meeting, I was fully aware of the specific concern because he had been involved in the meetings in June and July where we discussed it. But in those pre-meetings, I didn't specifically raise that. I had wondered how in a coronial inquest I could raise that specific concern. Stephen Cross, as we discussed, sent me an email which he had sent to the coroner, saying he had discussed it with the coroner's assistant before, and that the coroner was fully aware of our concerns. He also attached to that email the terms of reference for Jane Horden's case note review that were very detailed, and specifically said that this review would be looking for other causes, including things such as air embolism. So I guess at the time of the inquest, my understanding was that the coroner was fully aware. And again, when I reread the email, it is an assumption, but the coroner was fully aware of those specific concerns, and...
There isn't any evidence, in fact, that he was, is there? And I don't know whether you've seen his statement, but I don't think. He was aware, so he hadn't been told by Stephen Cross?
No.
And I don't think you proactively said in the conference meeting that you had suspicions, you didn't tell counsel?
No.
It may be for counsel to answer. Whether he in fact received that information via another source, such as Mr. Cross. But that's not a matter for you.
Sure.
You don't know if he did or he didn't?
Yes.
The GMC's good medical practice at the time, it was the 2013 version, obliges doctors to not deliberately leave out relevant information when they give evidence to legal proceedings. Were you aware of that, broadly speaking?
Broadly speaking, not the specific clause.
You were called to give evidence at the inquest, in fact, twice, because there was something of a discussion in respect of the cause of deaths, which required you to come back. Were you in fact sitting together with Dr. Shukla, or did you sort of go and sit down and come back up again?
Sorry, we went up, and then I think I was in the courtroom.
And then you went back to your seat and then came back up?
I think so. I don't think I went out of the room and had to come back in. So I think I was.
The first time you gave evidence, and please, in the interests of time, I am going to try and truncate what you said. But if I'm getting it wrong, you must correct me, please. You said that child A was stable when you came on shift. You discussed the long line insertion. And there's a great deal of analysis of the long line insertion during the inquest?
Yes.
And the administration of dextrose. Again, that's another issue which is discussed in detail. But you say quite candidly that there's nothing you could think of to explain the sudden deterioration, and that included the dextrose and the long line?
That's correct.
You mention your thought processes at the time. This is back in June 2015. So you are describing what's going through your mind as a senior doctor back in June 2015 when the child collapsed and died and you weren't thinking. You couldn't think of what had caused it at the time, that's correct?
That's correct, yes.
You made it clear that this was an unexplained collapse and that the child hadn't responded in a timely or normal way to resuscitation.
That's correct.
And you ruled out the causes I have mentioned, but also cardiac arrhythmia, the mother's medical condition, and the possibility of a thrombus which could have caused a blockage and led to an arrest. All of those you ruled out clinically? Dr. Shukla then gives evidence, and he is unable to give a natural or an unnatural cause. He clearly was baffled by why the baby had died. Do you remember that?
Yes, and I have seen the summaries as well.
Then you are recalled after that. And as you will have seen from the prior's note, which I know you have read because you mentioned it earlier, and I think you consider it to be a more accurate note than the other notes we have seen.
Yes.
Your task, as recorded in the note, is to try and assist with your pediatric knowledge in relation to the circumstances in Dr. Shukla, or in other words, help Dr. Shukla reach a conclusion about the cause of death. So you have moved slightly from being a witness of fact about your recollection, to being something of an expert, trying to explain to the coroner what might have happened. Did you understand that shift?
Not explicitly in those terms, no.
Does it make sense to you, as I put it to you now?
It does make sense in those terms, yes.
I mean, to put it bluntly, you are not being asked what you did or thought in June 2015. You are being asked what you think now. Has caused the child's death, how they have died.
Yes.
On those points, in answer to the various questions from the advocates and from the coroner, you consider the downgrading of the unit, and you mention the review, the independent review, and you talk about the initial feedback of the review that nothing had been found systemically with the training practices or equipment. You mention, well, this phrase is recorded and I would like to understand what you meant by it. A potential issue with staffing. Now, does that mean understaffing, the classic NHS lament, or does it mean a staff member?
That's a really good question. I have to assume that those were the words that I used. I am aware that the kind of hot feedback, if you like, from the college review discussed staffing numbers, but that wouldn't have been what I was referring to, because I didn't feel there was that. And I think it was an oblique reference to an individual member of staff. And actually, if I've reflected on this for a long, long time. And again, I guess my response is predicated on an understanding which it seems is not correct, that the coroner was aware of our concerns based on what Stephen Cross had told me, and that he was aware of the things that were being, or were supposed to have been investigated in the forensic review. And because of that, I was, to an extent, slightly surprised that the inquest was happening when a forensic review was going on. But I didn't query that. But clearly the coroner didn't have the understanding that I knew. You are absolutely correct. I am there in a coroner's court, and I should say what I think, and again, I didn't. I think, and again, and I reach out to baby A and B's parents for this, and maybe I should have done a supplementary statement or talked afterwards. I was trying to, in my discussion about the fact I couldn't explain this, in the context that my understanding was that the coroner knew of our concerns. I was trying to sort of throw as many breadcrumbs as possible for the coroner to pick up, without explicitly saying what the suspicion was. Why did I do that? And again, and I appreciate that this was the wrong judgment, I had baby A's parents sitting 10 feet away from me, and yes, absolutely, duty of candor. I just didn't have the courage to say it, and I think part of this was already from, I guess being influenced by the pushback that we were getting, that there's nothing to see here, and I regret not explicitly saying that then on many, many levels, because it should have been said, and I am not going to make excuses. I did have an understanding that the coroner was aware of our concerns, because I interpreted that's what Stephen Cross had told the coroner, and I should have done better.
You should have told the coroner that a member of staff may have been responsible for the child's death.
Yes, I should have done.
And one of the reasons why that was required was not only candor for the parents, Mother A was sat there, but also because the coroner has the equipment and the wherewithal to do exactly what you needed to get done?
Yes.
The expert investigation, the forensic pathology?
Yes.
The radiology review?
Yes.
All the things that in fact occurred later on?
Yes, absolutely. And, as I say, I am not using this as an excuse at all, but I was under the impression the coroner was aware of those concerns. But even if the coroner was aware of those concerns, I should have still been explicit.
Can I try and deal with Child M as well, and...
Yes, of course.
And his parents are watching these proceedings. I know you have followed these proceedings, and I don't want to assume that you followed them as closely as listening to all of the evidence, but they are particularly concerned that as your concern arose in respect of their child's collapse, you recall Child M collapsed, just like Child A?
Yes.
And I think you told the police at one point in 2019 they were the two children who really haunted you.
Yes.
In effect, those collapses, you had a chat or you had a discussion with the parents after Child M's collapse, but again, you didn't mention your suspicions. And this, we are now into 2016, well into the terrain, long after the suspicion has arisen in your and your colleagues' minds. Why was that?
The discussion that I had with baby M's family after he was resuscitated was I discussed that again. I couldn't explain it. It didn't fit with things. I think I would ask any colleague how to parents sitting there with the nurse there as well, can I express such a concern? And again, at this stage, yes, we were thinking the unthinkable, but it was this issue of not having evidence. And I wish I could turn the clock back and wish I could have said it, and I didn't, or later on. I think it's really difficult to appreciate my thought processes then, compared to what I know now, but I think I still probably wouldn't have expressed that concern immediately at that point. But
you didn't have to, did you? In fact, you could have waited until the horror of the situation.
Yes.
They were immensely affected by it, as you recall?
Absolutely.
You could have waited until that had abated somewhat, and revisited that issue?
Yes.
And I have to put to you, that Candour requires you to at least alert them to the possibility that there was an explanation that hadn't been looked at, which needed to be looked at, and that included deliberate harm.
I don't disagree.
Overall, I think you accept the proposition that once the suspicion arose that Letby was deliberately harming children, investigation was required to confirm or rule out that suspicion by hook, or by crook.
Yes, absolutely.
We know from the evidence of you, Dr. Breary and others, that discussions occurred internally really from the start of the cluster of deaths in June, and continued throughout the next year as to understand why the babies were dying at an increased rate. However, no clear causes or thematic causes were found, and you didn't identify the method of crime at any point yourself at that stage.
No, and I wasn't looking for methods of crime at that point. It was one of the possibilities, could these be unnatural events? But until June 2016, I would say I had not specifically considered how.
To be fair, it wasn't your job to.
No.
Investigate a crime?
No, absolutely. And it's my job to raise the concerns.
It is right, and I think you acknowledge today that there were in fact some significant signs in the records, which had a more comprehensive analysis been conducted, might have been spotted. The insulin C peptide results for the two children, for example, and of course child K, about whom you have been asked.
Yes.
There were those signals which were slightly more positive than inferential. But the concerns had been raised with Arian Powell very early on in 2015, and of course you had ultimately gone to the executives. They had been alerted to it via Alison Kelly early on, and then directly by you in the meetings. Is it fair to say that you found yourselves, this is the consultant body, you, Dr. Breary and your colleagues, locked into a process of investigation, the Royal College Review, the Horden Review, which wasn't in fact going to answer or confront the question that needed to be confronted? Was she harming babies?
Yes. So I think in terms of being locked into that process, you are absolutely correct. When we had formally raised in late June, early July, we discussed what the right way forwards. We discussed the police. My colleague, Dr. Saladi, in his email, explicitly said he didn't think there was anyone else who could do it. Yet we were told explicitly that it would be inappropriate to involve the police at this stage. And I remember, I forget which meeting it was in June, July 2016. We were told that it would be the end of the unit, there would be blue and white tape everywhere, the whole place would be a crime scene. Everyone would be a suspect. Now, I understand this now, that that's not how it works when these issues are raised actually. There are actually mechanisms in place for raising these issues without disruption to service. I think from that point, because we knew Letby had been moved, as I mentioned, I don't think complacency, but there was slightly less urgency, and I suppose I can't speak for colleagues, what I anticipated the college review and the case note review would support what had been found by our own thematic reviews, and at that point the police would be involved. And there was a delay in us having access to the information from those. And then events went from there, and I am glad that we from that point were assertive enough to not accept the executive's interpretations of what they found, but I do feel we were locked into that. Now, could we have actually put our hands up at any point and said, look, this is all very well, but this isn't the right thing to do? We could have done. I think it's very difficult when we have been told by the executive body, particularly someone who has a legal and policing background, that it is the wrong thing to do. And I should have been more curious and challenged it.
Without going into great detail, because I am in danger of going over my time with you, but were you fully aware that the Royal College were never going to answer the question that you needed to confront? And likewise with Dr. Horden, in fact. They were really staging posts, as it turned out.
I think if I look at the terms of reference of the Royal College Review, to look for any, I forget the exact terms, but any factors that could have contributed to the deaths.
Yes.
And if I look at the terms of reference of the original terms of reference of the Horden Review, in particular, the original terms of reference of the Horden Review, I think either those terms of reference would have found something that would have flagged up something unnatural, or they wouldn't have. And if they had found something unnatural, it would have gone down the police line, and if they hadn't, I anticipated that then the next response would be to escalate to the police. Now, obviously, I shouldn't assume what any review is going to find, but given that these were pediatricians undertaking these reviews, and I talked to them and my colleagues had talked to them, and they had heard what we had said, I felt at that point, although I felt it needed to be escalated, and there is an element of, I think I said it's minuted somewhere, that there was part of me that was almost hoping that they would find something explainable and clinical, because that's, so in many ways, awful as it is so much easier to deal with than the reality of things.
And ordinarily the probability is that they would have done, and when you have a cluster of deaths, there usually is a clinical explanation for it?
Usually, and I think again, this is all about us or me, I can't speak for others, trying to make things fit and not having the courage to think outside the box.
I am not going to take you through all the various committees and groups that existed back in 2015-2016, but I am going to try and deal with it sort of compendiously, if I can. There clearly was a patient safety issue as suspicions arose in respect of Lucy Letby harming children, and there clearly was a parallel safeguarding issue. They are, in the context, it's the same point, isn't it?
Yes.
Safeguarding patient?
Yes.
Patient safety. There was an opportunity to take your concerns and suspicions to the safeguarding team, and that opportunity was not taken in terms?
Yes. I think by engaging the SUDIC process for the deaths, it would have automatically been on the safeguarding radar.
That could have occurred really early on?
It could have occurred early on. I don't know whether early on deliberate harm would have been considered, but the pattern as things progressed could well have been recognized earlier on.
In terms of the external lifelines, again without discussing them in detail, but trying to deal with them all in one go, there is obviously the CDOP route, which you have discussed, but there is the wider national bodies, the GMC, the NMC, the CQC, NHS England, and of course you have already talked about the coroner and the police. But those other bodies, they all have abilities, or they all have the capacity to receive concerns or whistleblowing issues and to start to help with them being raised. As I understand your evidence, really, you didn't feel that could you really go anywhere outside the trust?
Yes, I think, again, speaking for myself, but I think I speak for colleagues, we just didn't know where we could go. And I think there's some levels, number one about the concern, but also subsequently about the response to concerns when we raised them. And I was not aware at the time that all the bodies to whom you refer had processes that we could have followed. And I will be honest now. I am still not entirely clear specifically what they are.
Did you look at, you can type in GMC, NMC, and up come a whole raft of...
My understand of the GMC and NMC was, again, you had to have a degree of evidence.
Well, what they might have done is say, you need to go to the police?
Yes.
Any of those bodies, in fact, may have said, this isn't really an issue about the adequacy of care. It is not your standard whistleblowing.
Yes.
This is much more serious.
Yes.
It's criminal.
And in many ways, I wish somebody had just said that to us, you know. When we initially raised it in June 16, we were told, not the police, when we discussed it with the Royal College reviewers, we were told, why don't you just go to the police? Well, I don't know what the coroner was told in February 17. I don't know what Simon Medlin was briefed, but absolutely. I think, looking back, we shouldn't have had to have waited for permission to go to the police. We should have just gone.
Because the only way that Lucy Letby was either going to be incriminated or exculpated was by full investigation, of which the police were best equipped?
Yes, absolutely. And again, there was the misapprehension that, and we thought it was reinforced to us by people in the trust we raised issues to, that you hadn't got enough evidence to go to the police, which I understand now is absurd because, as you say, the people who find the evidence are the people investigating.
Thank you, Dr. Jayaram. Those are my questions. My lady, I hope I haven't gone too far over my limit.
Thank you. Can I just say thank you very much for inviting me here today? Can I say again to the parents of the babies involved that I am sorry for my own personal failings, and I apologize for things that I could and should have done better. I know that my words will never ever help to ease the grief that you feel, and I also want to reach out to you. And I'm sorry that you are having to go through the external noise that's out there, of people taking another view on everything that's happened. And I appreciate how painful that must be for you, and how insensitive it is of the people who are trying to suggest that other things happened. And once again, I thank you for your patience with me very much.